February 3rd, 1945. Dawn breaks over RAF Mendlesham in Suffolk, and Technical Sergeant Raymond Fredette climbs into the bombardier's position of a B-17G Flying Fortress named Fancy Nancy. Someone has scratched Fat Boy Hector on his chin turret, a jab at his waistline that still stings from yesterday. But the insult fades to nothing when he learns the target. Berlin, 550 miles into the heart of what remains of Hitler's Reich. And Fredette's aircraft is just one small piece of something unprecedented. Over 1,000 B-17 Flying Fortresses are preparing to take off from 122 airfields across eastern England. 1,000 bombers, not a raid, a migration. An airborne nation the size of a medium city, each aircraft carrying 10 men and 7,000 pounds of high explosive, all pointed at the same destination. When the formation assembles over the English Channel, it will stretch across 40 miles of sky, and somewhere over Germany, Luftwaffe pilots will look up at this armada and realize with cold certainty that the war is already lost. The mathematics of what's about to happen are straightforward and terrifying. Each B-17G carries 13 50 caliber machine guns. 1,000 bombers equals 13,000 heavy machine guns, all capable of firing 750 rounds per minute with an effective range of 3,500 feet. But the real weapon isn't the guns. It's the formation itself, a three-dimensional lattice of interlocking defensive fire so dense that approaching it represents not tactical risk, but statistical certainty of death. The Luftwaffe has been fighting American bomber formations for 2.5 years. They've developed tactics, specialized aircraft, heavier cannon, unguided rockets. They've learned to attack from head-on where the bomber's forward armament was weakest, to concentrate on stragglers, to use twin-engine fighters firing massive air-to-air rockets from outside defensive gun range. None of it matters anymore, because the scale has changed. What worked against 100 bombers or even 300 becomes mathematically impossible against 1,000. Every German fighter pilot knows it. Their commanders know it. Hermann Göring knows it, though he won't admit it. And Adolf Galland, general of fighters until his recent removal following the fighter pilots' revolt, knows it better than anyone. The Luftwaffe is drowning in numbers it can no longer match. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 3 years earlier, the story looked very different. August 17th, 1942. 12 B-17E Flying Fortresses attack the marshalling yards at Rouen, France, in the 8th Air Force's first bombing mission from England. The bombers fly in loose 6-plane squadrons with 2 to 4 miles between each squadron, a formation designed primarily to prevent mid-air collisions rather than provide mutual defensive fire. All 12 aircraft return safely with only minor flak damage. It's a shallow penetration, barely 50 miles into occupied France, escorted the entire way by RAF Spitfires. But American planners know this represents nothing close to what will be required. The real targets lie deep inside Germany: Messerschmitt factories in Regensburg, ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt, oil refineries in Ploesti, aircraft assembly plants scattered across southern Germany. These are strategic targets, the kind that require precision daylight bombing to destroy, and reaching them means flying hundreds of miles through hostile airspace where German fighters operate from their own bases, where they can land, rearm, refuel, and attack the same bomber stream multiple times. The operational challenge is immense. From bases in East Anglia to targets in central Germany measures over 500 miles each way. At bomber cruising speeds of 180 miles per hour, missions last 8 to 10 hours. Crews spend that entire time at altitudes of 25,000 to 30,000 feet, where temperatures reach 40 degrees below zero, and oxygen is required for survival. And in 1942 and most of 1943, they make those missions without fighter escort for the deepest penetrations. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, when it arrives, has a combat radius of only 125 miles on internal fuel. Even with drop tanks introduced in late 1943, it can only escort bombers to roughly 275 miles from base, enough to cover targets in western Germany, but inadequate for the deep penetration missions that matter most. The bombers have only their own defensive armament, and that armament, in 1942, is inadequate. The B-17E carries 9 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 2 in a powered top turret behind the cockpit, 2 in the revolutionary Sperry ball turret beneath the aircraft, 2 in the manually operated tail turret, additional guns in the radio operator's compartment and waist positions, plus a single flexible gun in the nose. The Browning M2 weighs 64 pounds, measures 57 inches long, and fires 750 rounds per minute, with an effective range of 3,500 feet, significantly longer than the German 20mm MGFF cannons initially used by Luftwaffe fighters. But the gun's theoretical range doesn't matter if the formation can't bring concentrated fire to bear on attacking fighters, and the early formations can't. 6 plane squadrons, separated by miles, provide no mutual support. When German fighters attack, each bomber fights alone. A B-17 isolated from its companions has guns covering different arcs, but gaps remain. The nose is particularly vulnerable, defended by only 2 manual guns with extremely limited fields of fire forward. Luftwaffe fighter ace Egon Meyer identifies this weakness in November 1942. A head-on attack, though requiring exceptional skill and courage, allows German fighters to concentrate fire on the bomber's most vulnerable spot. The plexiglass nose where the bombardier and navigator work, behind that nose sits the cockpit where pilot and co-pilot control the aircraft. Kill the pilots and the bomber goes down even if the rest of the crew survives. Meyer calculates the geometry. A head-on attack means flying straight toward oncoming bombers at full throttle. The closing speed is approximately 500 miles per hour. A B-17 cruises at 180 miles per hour. A German FW-190 or Bf-109, attacking at full speed, approaches at roughly 320 miles per hour. Combined closing speed of 500 miles per hour equals roughly 730 feet per second. A German pilot has perhaps 3 seconds from the time he opens fire at maximum range until he must break away to avoid collision. In those 3 seconds, a skilled pilot can rake the B-17's nose and cockpit with 20mm cannon fire, destroying flight controls and killing the crew before anyone else in the bomber formation can effectively return fire. The tactic works. By December 1942, the head-on attack becomes standard Luftwaffe procedure, and American losses begin climbing to unsustainable levels. Colonel Curtis LeMay, commanding the 305th Bombardment Group, understands the problem with brutal clarity. Scattered bombers are dead bombers. The only solution is formations tight enough to create overlapping fields of defensive fire, dense enough that attacking fighters face concentrated gunfire from multiple aircraft simultaneously. In December 1942, LeMay develops what he calls the Javelin Down formation. 18 aircraft arranged in 6 3-plane elements, stacked vertically and horizontally. The formation measures 600 feet high from lowest to highest bomber, 500 feet deep from front to back, and nearly 2,500 feet across. Most importantly, every bomber in the formation can bring its guns to bear on an attacking fighter from almost any direction. The formation flies its first combat mission on December 6, 1942, attacking Lille, France. German fighters make several passes but cannot penetrate the concentrated defensive fire. The 305th loses no aircraft. The other B-17 groups in England immediately adopt the formation. By January 1943, LeMay has refined it into a 21-plane wedge, adding additional bombers to the most vulnerable low squadron. The configuration proves so effective it becomes standard through September of that year. A 1943 Army Air Forces survey later confirms what every crew already knows from experience. Just over half of all B-17 seconds shot down by Germans during attacks on European targets were aircraft that had left the main formation. A bomber that falls out of formation due to battle damage, mechanical failure, or crew error has perhaps a 20% chance of reaching friendly territory. Most are swarmed by German fighters within minutes. Conversely, a bomber maintaining its position in a tight formation has better than 50% survival odds, even on heavily opposed missions. The difference between life and death is often nothing more than holding position in the combat box. But tight formations create their own problems. Individual bombers cannot take evasive action while in formation. They must fly straight and level, maintaining position regardless of flak or fighter attacks. This makes the formations vulnerable to German anti-aircraft artillery, which by 1943 numbers over 1 million personnel operating thousands of heavy guns. The standard German heavy flak gun, the legendary 8.8 cm, Flak 1836371 series, fires an 8.8 kg high-explosive shell to altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet. These guns are positioned in batteries around key targets. When formations approach, flak batteries calculate where the formation will be in 30 seconds and fill that airspace with exploding shells. Flak ultimately accounts for 40% of all wounds sustained by 8th Air Force personnel, a higher percentage than fighter attacks. The true test comes in August and October 1943 during the deep penetration missions to Regensburg and Schweinfurt. August 17, 1943, exactly 1 year after the 8th Air Force's first mission, 376 B-17s launch a double-strike mission. Curtis LeMay, now commanding the 3rd Air Division, personally leads the Regensburg mission. 146 B-17s from 7 bomb groups will strike the Messerschmitt aircraft factory at Regensburg, then continue south across the Alps to bases in North Africa. A second force of 230 B-17s from 9 groups will attack ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt and return to England. The mission begins badly. Dense fog covers English airfields. Weather delays force a 3-hour gap between the two strikes instead of the planned 30 minutes. This destroys the entire tactical plan. German radar tracks both formations from takeoff. The long delay gives German fighter controllers time to land, rearm, refuel, and attack both formations. The Regensburg force encounters German fighters almost immediately after crossing the Dutch coast. Bf 109 seconds and FW 190 seconds attack in waves. Despite the attacks, the formations press on. 24 B-17s are shot down. The Schweinfurt force fares worse. Delayed by hours, they face German fighters that have already attacked the Regensburg force, returned to base, rearmed, and taken off again. The Schweinfurt force loses 36 B-17s out of 183 that reach the target. Combined losses for the day are 60 bombers and approximately 600 crewmen, a loss rate of 20%. The post-mission analysis reveals a crucial pattern. Over half the bombers shot down had left the protection of the main formation. Aircraft that maintained formation discipline and stayed in assigned positions had dramatically higher survival rates. The defensive fire forced German pilots to break off attacks sooner, made accurate gunnery difficult, and occasionally shot them down. The formations work exactly as designed, but without fighter escort to keep German fighters away, losses remain catastrophic and unsustainable. October 14, 1943, Black Thursday, the 8th Air Force returns to Schweinfurt for a second attempt to destroy the ball-bearing plants. 291 B-17s take off that morning. Weather is miserable. Assembly into formation takes longer than planned. The mission is nearly scrubbed, but commanders decide to proceed. Only about half the expected P-47 escort fighters are able to rendezvous with the bomber formations. As the B-17s in their combat box formations approach Aachen on the German-Belgian border, the Thunderbolts waggle their wings in the traditional farewell gesture and turn for home, their fuel exhausted. The bombers continue alone into Germany. Then the Luftwaffe strikes with unprecedented force. German fighter controllers have tracked the formations from takeoff. Every available fighter unit in Western Germany is scrambled. Over 300 German fighters attack the bomber stream in coordinated waves. Single-engine Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs come in 3 and 4 abreast, attacking head-on. They're followed by twin-engine fighters firing WGR-21 rockets from 1,000 yards out. The massive rockets force formations to scatter as individual B-17s take evasive action, breaking up the combat boxes and ruining the mutually supporting defensive fire. The German pilots fly from home bases in Germany. many within 50 miles of the bomber route. After expending ammunition, they land, get rearmed and refueled in 15 to 20 minutes, and take off again to attack the same bomber stream a second or even third time. By the time formations reach Schweinfurt, 28 bombers have already been lost. The bombing is accurate despite the chaos, but the cost is beyond anything previously experienced. Of the 291 B-17 seconds that departed England that morning, 60 are shot down by fighters or flak. Another 17 return so heavily damaged they must be scrapped. Another 121 aircraft land with varying degrees of battle damage. Total losses represent over 26% of the attacking force. Aircrew casualties are equally severe. 650 men are lost out of 2,900 who flew the mission, representing 22% of all crews. At that loss rate, an aircrew member has virtually no chance of surviving a 25-mission tour. The immediate aftermath of Black Thursday forces fundamental reassessment of American daylight bombing doctrine. For the rest of 1943, the 8th Air Force limits operations to targets within range of fighter escorts. Deep penetration missions to targets in central and southern Germany are suspended indefinitely. This is not defeat, rather a necessary operational pause while solutions are implemented, and the primary solution is already in development. By late 1943, the North American P-51B Mustang begins entering service with the 8th Air Force. Powered by a Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and equipped with external drop tanks, the P-51B has a combat radius of over 650 miles, enough to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The Mustang combines extraordinary range with excellent performance. At 30,000 feet altitude, where bombers and German fighters operate, the P-51B can match or exceed the performance of Bf-109 seconds and FW-190 seconds. When P-51 equipped fighter groups begin escorting bomber missions in February 1944, the strategic balance shifts decisively. Big Week, February 20th through 25th, 1944, demonstrates the transformation. The 8th and 15th Air Forces conduct an all-out campaign against Germany's aviation industry. Heavy bombers hammer aircraft, engine, and ball-bearing plants by day. RAF bombers strike the same targets at night. Major General Jimmy Doolittle, commanding 8th Air Force since late 1943, orders a crucial tactical change. Allied fighters are no longer restricted to close bomber escort. They're freed to sweep ahead of the bomber formations, to hunt German fighters before they can approach the bombers. The change is unpopular with bomber crews, but its effects are immediate and dramatic. German fighters that attempt to intercept bomber formations now face swarms of P-51 Mustangs operating in air supremacy mode. The Luftwaffe is forced into a war of attrition it cannot win. During Big Week, the 8th Air Force loses 97 B-17 seconds and 40 B-24 seconds out of thousands of sorties flown. The losses, while still significant, represent a much smaller percentage of the attacking force than previous unescorted missions. More importantly, the Luftwaffe loses fighters and pilots at unsustainable rates. German pilot quality begins declining as experienced aces are killed faster than they can be replaced. By June 6, 1944, D-Day Allied air forces have achieved complete air supremacy over Europe. German fighters have been largely swept from the skies through systematic attrition. Bomber formations can operate with relative impunity over most of Germany. Loss rates drop from 20% in October 1943 to 3 to 5% by mid-1944, levels that are sustainable. The psychological impact is enormous. New crews arriving in theatre can look at veterans who have completed tours and know survival is possible. But the most dramatic transformation is still ahead, because air supremacy means the 8th Air Force can do something previously impossible. It can grow, and grow, and grow until the number of bombers filling the sky becomes not just tactically overwhelming but psychologically devastating to anyone watching from below. The logistics of expansion are staggering. Building 12,000 B-17 Flying Fortresses requires millions of man-hours and coordination across dozens of states. Training tens of thousands of pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners to operate as coordinated teams demands training infrastructure on an unprecedented scale. Transporting these crews to England and integrating them into combat operations represents an organisational challenge as demanding as the combat itself. By mid-1944, the 8th Air Force has grown from the small force that flew 12 bombers to Rouen in August 1942 into something that resembles an airborne nation. 42 bomb groups operating from 122 airfields across eastern England. When all groups launch simultaneously for a major mission, the sound of engines starting reverberates across the land for miles. Tens of thousands of Wright Cyclone engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower, all warming up at the same time. The thunder can be heard in London, 100 miles away. The formations themselves have evolved. The basic 21 plane group formation developed by LeMay remains the building block, but groups now fly as part of larger combat wings. 3 groups flying together as a wing, stacked vertically and horizontally, create a 54-plane formation fielding over 700 heavy machine guns. Multiple wings flying in trail create division-sized formations. Multiple divisions create Air Force-sized formations, and when the entire 8th Air Force launches for a maximum effort mission, the resulting formation stretches across 40 miles of sky and takes over an hour to pass any given point on the ground. German radar operators watching their scopes see returns unlike anything they've witnessed before. Not individual aircraft, not small groups, but a solid mass of contacts so dense the individual planes cannot be distinguished. Luftwaffe fighter controllers scrambling their pilots know before the formations even cross the Dutch coast that the day is going to be a bloodbath. And not for the Americans. Lieutenant Heinz Snoke, flying with Jagdgeschwader 11, describes watching an 8th Air Force maximum effort mission approach in his combat diary. The entry is dated September 11th, 1944, during a raid on synthetic oil plants in central Germany. "We climb to 9,000 meters," he writes, "and there ahead of us stretches the American formation. I cannot count them. The sky is filled with bombers from horizon to horizon. 400, 500, more, and above them, glinting in the sun, are their escorts. Mustangs everywhere. We are 12 aircraft, 12 against hundreds. We make one firing pass and dive away before the escorts can engage. I see my cannon strikes hit a fortress, but it continues flying. Then we are running for our lives with Mustangs chasing us down to the deck. The psychological impact on German pilots cannot be overstated. These are men who remember 1941 and 1942 when the Luftwaffe dominated European skies. Many are veterans of the Eastern Front where they accumulated impressive victory tallies against Soviet aircraft. They've been trained to think of themselves as an elite force, the tip of the spear for German military power. And now they're facing formations so massive that attacking them represents not tactical challenge, but suicide mission. The mathematics are inescapable. A Luftwaffe fighter unit might field 20 to 30 aircraft on a given day. Those aircraft face bomber formations numbering in the hundreds, each bomber carrying 13 heavy machine guns, escorted by fighters that outnumber the German interceptors 2 or 3 to 1. And those American escorts are flying P-51 Mustangs that match or exceed German fighter performance while having enough fuel to stay with the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The breaking point for many German pilots isn't a single catastrophic defeat, it's the accumulation of missions where they take off, knowing the odds are impossible, where they watch friends die not because of tactical errors or bad luck, but because the sheer weight of numbers makes survival a mathematical improbability. Oberleutnant Johannes Naumann, who flew with Jagdgeschwader 26, later described the feeling in interviews conducted decades after the war. By late 1944, he said, "We knew every time we took off that we probably wouldn't be coming back. Not because we weren't skilled. Many of us were aces, with dozens of victories, but because there were just too many of them and too few of us. You could shoot down one bomber, maybe 2 if you were very skilled and very lucky, but then the Mustangs would find you, and that was that. Or you'd run out of ammunition before you could do any real damage and have to dive away while hundreds more bombers continued toward their targets. If you find this story engaging, Please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The truly massive raids begin in autumn 1944 and continue through the war's end in May 1945. These are missions that deploy not hundreds but over 1,000 heavy bombers in a single day, attacking multiple targets simultaneously or concentrating overwhelming force against a single strategic objective. The scale of these operations represents industrial warfare in its purest form. Not tactical elegance or brilliant operational art, but raw productive capacity translated into aerial dominance through sheer overwhelming numbers. December 24, 1944, Christmas Eve. While American and British soldiers fight desperately to contain the German offensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, the 8th Air Force launches the largest single-day air operation in history up to that point. 2,034 aircraft take off from bases across England. The force includes over 1,300 heavy bombers, B-17 seconds and B-24 Liberators, plus more than 700 fighters providing escort and conducting ground attack missions. The targets are German airfields and communication centres behind the Ardennes front, intended to disrupt German logistics and prevent the Luftwaffe from providing air support to the ground offensive. The scale is difficult to comprehend. 2,000 aircraft assembling into formation over England creates traffic control problems that border on impossible. Bomber groups take off in sequence, each climbing to assigned altitudes while circling assembly beacons, radio transmitters that broadcast distinctive signals allowing aircraft to home in on their assigned formation points. The process takes hours. Some groups circle for 90 minutes before their entire formation is assembled and ready to proceed to the target. The fuel consumption during assembly is substantial enough that bombers occasionally have to abort missions because they've burned too much fuel just getting into formation, leaving insufficient reserves to reach the target and return. When the formation is finally assembled and heads toward the continent, it stretches across the sky in a stream that takes well over an hour to pass any given point. German radar operators tracking this armada report formations so dense that individual aircraft returns merge into solid blocks on their scopes. Luftwaffe fighter controllers receive reports of the incoming raids and face impossible decisions. They have perhaps 200 fighters available across all of Western Germany. Scrambling every available aircraft still leaves them outnumbered 6 or 7 to 1 by bombers alone, not counting the 700 Allied fighters that will be protecting the bomber stream. Some units scramble anyway. Attacking is what they were trained to do, what their honor as fighter pilots demands. They climb to altitude, sight the formations, and make firing passes knowing they face overwhelming opposition. Hauptmann Anton Haeckel, a Luftwaffe ace with 192 confirmed victories by war's end, leads his unit against the Christmas Eve formations. After landing, he reports to his superiors with stark honesty. "We cannot stop them. There are too many. We shot down perhaps 5 bombers, 5 out of over 1,000, and we lost 3 of our own aircraft in the process. The mathematics are not sustainable. We are trading experienced pilots in expensive fighters for a handful of bomber kills that the Americans replace within days. This cannot continue." But it does continue. Through January, February, and March 1945, the maximum effort missions keep coming. January 29, 1945. The 8th Air Force dispatches over 1,000 heavy bombers against oil refineries and transportation targets in Western Germany. February 3, 1945. The mission that Technical Sergeant Raymond Fredette flies in Fancy Nancy, over 1,000 B-17 Flying Fortresses attack Berlin, the heart of the Reich. This is the mission where the psychological weight of American air power becomes impossible to deny, even for the most fanatical believers in German victory. The Berlin raid of February 3, 1945, represents everything the Luftwaffe has been trying to prevent for 2.5 years. 1,000 heavy bombers penetrate the capital, bomb in daylight with reasonable accuracy, and return to England with losses below 3%. The defensive fire from that many bombers makes approach suicidal. The escort fighters, P-51 Mustangs that outnumber German interceptors, swat down the few Luftwaffe fighters that try to attack. German flak batteries fill the sky with explosive shells, but the formations are so large that even substantial flak barrages claim relatively few victims. Most bombers simply fly through the flak fields, absorb whatever damage they sustain, and continue to target. For Luftwaffe pilots watching from below or attempting futile intercepts, the sight is devastating. Oberfeldwebel Heinz Marquardt, who flew with Jagdgeschwader 1, later described what he witnessed from the ground that day. His unit was based at an airfield northeast of Berlin, and mechanical problems had grounded his aircraft, forcing him to watch the raid from the ground. The sound came first, he recalled, a deep rumble that grew and grew until it seemed to shake the earth. Then we saw them, wave after wave, formation after formation, stretching from horizon to horizon. The flak batteries were firing constantly, filling the sky with black bursts, but the bombers just kept coming. There were so many of them that it seemed impossible they could all fit in the sky. And I remember thinking, very clearly, we've already lost this war. We lost it when the Americans decided to build 1,000 bombers and send them all here at once. The raid drops nearly 2,500 tons of high explosive on Berlin's transportation infrastructure, including marshalling yards, railway stations, and government buildings. Post-raid reconnaissance photographs show extensive damage, but the strategic impact goes beyond physical destruction. The psychological message is unmistakable. The Americans can strike anywhere in Germany with overwhelming force, and there's nothing the Luftwaffe can do to stop them. The few German fighters that attempt intercepts are brushed aside. The flak causes some casualties, but nowhere near enough to prevent mission success, and most importantly, the bombers keep coming back. Berlin is attacked again on February 26th, and again on March 18th. The March 18th raid represents perhaps the single most overwhelming display of American air power during the entire war. On this day, the 8th Air Force dispatches 1,329 heavy bombers and 733 fighters against targets in Berlin and across northern Germany. This represents essentially the entire operational strength of the 8th Air Force, every group that can fly, launching simultaneously in a demonstration of force that makes previous maximum efforts look modest by comparison. The bomber stream takes nearly 90 minutes to pass over any given point. German radar tracks the formation from takeoff, and reports arrive at Luftwaffe High Command headquarters, describing an aerial armada of unprecedented size. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commanding the Luftwaffe, receives the reports in his headquarters and reportedly responds with rage mixed with despair. Göring has spent years insisting that the Luftwaffe remains capable of defending German airspace, that American losses are unsustainable, that the tide will turn. March 18, 1945, destroys these delusions. The Americans are not just winning the air war, they're flaunting their dominance, sending over 2,000 aircraft deep into German territory, and daring anyone to stop them. The Luftwaffe scrambles every available fighter, perhaps 300 aircraft scattered across northern Germany. They make isolated attacks against the bomber stream. Some B-17 seconds go down, but the vast majority reach their targets, drop their bombs, and return to England safely. The loss rate for the entire mission is less than 2%. For German pilots, March 18th represents a bitter confirmation of what many have known for months. The war in the air is over. One Luftwaffe pilot, whose name survives only in fragmentary intelligence reports compiled by Allied interrogators after the war, put it simply when captured a few weeks later. "When we saw over 1,000 bombers in one formation," he said, "we knew we were finished. You cannot fight numbers like that. You cannot train pilots fast enough, build aircraft fast enough, produce fuel fast enough to compete with a nation that can build 1,000 bombers and send them all to Berlin on a Tuesday afternoon. The Americans won the war in their factories. We just didn't realize it until we saw the results filling the sky." The technical achievement represented by these massive formations cannot be understated. Coordinating the takeoff, assembly, routing, and attack of over 1,000 aircraft requires organizational capabilities that border on the miraculous. Each bomber group takes off from its assigned airfield at a scheduled time, climbs to altitude while circling an assembly beacon, forms into group formation, then proceeds to a division assembly point where multiple groups merge into larger formations. The divisions then proceed to predetermined points where they merge with other divisions to form the complete bomber stream. All of this happens according to a flight plan calculated down to the minute, accounting for variables like weather, wind speed, aircraft performance differences, and fuel consumption. The communications challenge alone is staggering. Radio silence is maintained during most of the assembly process to prevent German radio direction finding from tracking the formations. Groups identify each other through visual signals, specific aircraft markings, and flares fired at designated times. Lead navigators use dead reckoning and celestial navigation to maintain course accuracy. Any significant deviation can result in formations arriving at targets at wrong times or wrong locations, causing bombing errors or leaving portions of the bomber stream vulnerable to concentrated fighter attacks. The maintenance infrastructure required to keep this aerial armada flying is equally impressive. Each B-17 requires approximately 200 man-hours of maintenance for every hour of flight time. With missions lasting 8 to 10 hours, that translates to 1,600 to 2,000 man-hours of maintenance per bomber per mission. Multiply by 1,000 bombers and you're looking at over 1.5 million man-hours of maintenance work between maximum effort missions. Ground crews work 20-hour days during peak operations periods, servicing engines, replacing damaged components, repairing battle damage, loading ammunition, fueling aircraft, and performing countless other tasks necessary to keep the bombers flying. The ammunition expenditure during these missions represents industrial production on an incomprehensible scale. Each B-17G carries approximately 7,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition distributed across its 13 gun positions. 1,000 bombers equals 7 million rounds of ammunition loaded before each mission. During the mission, gunners will fire a substantial portion of this ammunition at German fighters or in test firing to ensure guns are functioning. The brass casings from spent rounds pile up inside aircraft by the thousands. After landing, ground crews spend hours unloading expended brass and unfired ammunition before the next mission. The empty cases are collected, shipped back to the United States, and recycled into new ammunition in a logistics chain that spans the Atlantic. The human cost of these operations, even with low loss rates, remains sobering. A 2% loss rate on a 1,000-bomber mission means 20 aircraft lost. Each B-17 carries 10 crew members. 20 aircraft equals 200 men killed, wounded, or captured in a single day's operations. And while 2% represents a sustainable loss rate from a strategic perspective, far below the 20% losses of Black Thursday, each loss is still a crew that went to breakfast that morning, climbed into their aircraft, and never came home. Ground crews wait at their hard stands, counting bombers as they return. When their aircraft doesn't appear, when the designated landing time passes and then keeps passing, they know. The empty hard stand becomes a memorial to men they ate with, played cards with, worked alongside. The psychological impact on surviving crews is profound. By late 1944 and early 1945, most bomber crewmen have seen friends die. They've watched B-17 seconds explode from flak hits or fighter attacks. They've witnessed mid-air collisions during assembly. They've flown through formations where damaged bombers dropped out of position, fell behind, and were swarmed by German fighters. They know, statistically, that their chances of surviving a 25-mission tour have improved dramatically compared to 1943. But statistics don't prevent nightmares or eliminate the knot of fear that forms in your stomach during pre-flight briefings when the curtain pulls back to reveal the target. Staff Sergeant Thomas Childers, a radio operator flying with the 384th Bomb Group, wrote letters home that survived the war and were later donated to the Air Force Historical Research Agency. In a letter dated March 20, 1945, 2 days after the massive Berlin raid, Childers describes the psychological reality of flying in 1,000-bomber formations. "You'd think having 1,000 bombers around you would make you feel safer," he writes. And in some ways it does. The Germans can't possibly attack all of us at once. But it also means you're watching 20 or 30 bombers go down on every mission. You see them fall out of formation trailing smoke. You see parachutes if the crew had time to bail out, which often they don't. And you think about the fact that each of those aircraft had 10 men in it, just like us, and now they're either dead or prisoners or, if they're very lucky, evading through occupied territory. The scale doesn't make it easier. It makes it harder because you can't look away. You can't pretend it's not happening when there are pieces of aircraft falling out of the formation a quarter-mile in front of you. The Luftwaffe's response to these overwhelming formations evolves desperation into experimentation and finally into effective abandonment of daylight fighter operations. By early 1945, German fighter units have been so depleted through attrition that mounting effective resistance becomes impossible. The few remaining experienced pilots are vastly outnumbered. New pilots arrive at operational units with minimal training, sometimes less than 30 hours in type, barely enough to take off and land safely, let alone engage in air combat against veteran American pilots flying superior aircraft. These inexperienced pilots have survival times measured in missions, often single digits. They take off, attempt one or two intercepts, and are shot down by American escorts or by bomber defensive fire. The desperation produces experiments with weapons that seem designed more for psychological impact than tactical effectiveness. The Luftwaffe deploys Messerschmitt Me 163 rocket-powered interceptors. These aircraft can climb to 30,000 feet in under 3 minutes and attack at speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour, making them nearly impossible for bomber gunners to track. But the Me 163 has severe limitations. Its rocket engine burns through fuel in 8 minutes, providing only a few minutes of combat time before the pilot must glide back to base. The aircraft is dangerous to its own pilots. The rocket fuel is so corrosive that even small leaks during landing can dissolve the pilot. Combat effectiveness is minimal. The closing speeds are so high that German pilots have perhaps 1 second to aim and fire before overshooting their targets. Most attacks miss entirely. The Luftwaffe also deploys Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighters, the world's first operational jet-powered fighter aircraft. The Me 262 is genuinely revolutionary, capable of speeds exceeding 540 miles per hour, making it significantly faster than any Allied piston-engine fighter. But production problems, fuel shortages, and Hitler's insistence on using the aircraft as a bomber rather than pure fighter limit its effectiveness. By the time Me 262 seconds appear in significant numbers in early 1945, Allied air superiority is so complete that the jets struggle to take off and land without being caught by patrolling American fighters. P-51 Mustang pilots learn to orbit known Me 262 bases and attack the jets during their vulnerable takeoff and landing phases when their speed advantage is negated. Some Luftwaffe units attempt ram attacks, literally flying their aircraft into bombers after expending ammunition. The tactic, called Sonderkommando Elbe, involves volunteer pilots flying stripped-down Bf-109 seconds with minimal fuel and armament. The pilot makes a firing pass at a bomber, and if that doesn't bring it down, deliberately collides with it before bailing out. The tactic is employed on April 7, 1945, during a raid on oil targets. Approximately 120 German fighters, many flown by pilots barely out of training, attack an 8th Air Force formation of 1,336 bombers. The ram attacks bring down some bombers, perhaps 15 to 20, but the cost is catastrophic. Over 70 German fighters are lost, including many of the volunteer pilots who either fail to bail out in time or are killed by defensive fire before reaching ramming distance. The tactic is never employed again, the losses are unsustainable, and the results negligible compared to the size of people, the formations being attacked. By April 1945, organized Luftwaffe resistance to American daylight bombing has effectively ceased. German fighters occasionally appear, usually in small numbers, make token attacks, and withdraw. Most missions proceed to targets with minimal opposition. The flak remains dangerous, particularly over heavily defended targets, but even flak effectiveness has declined. Ammunition shortages, personnel losses, and the sheer scale of attacking formations all combine to reduce the threat. Bomber crews completing tours in early 1945 face dramatically different conditions than crews in 1943. The war in the air is over. The only question is when the ground war will catch up. The final massive formation missions of the war occur in April 1945. April 10, 1945, the 8th Air Force dispatches over 1,300 bombers against airfields and ammunition dumps in northern Germany. The resistance is negligible. Loss rates are below 1%. April 25, 1945, another maximum effort mission with over 1,200 bombers attacking transportation targets and troop concentrations. By this point, many crews are flying missions where they don't see a single German fighter. The Luftwaffe has been destroyed through attrition, its pilots dead or grounded by fuel shortages, its aircraft destroyed on the ground or broken up for parts. The massive American formations fly over Germany virtually unopposed, demonstrating air supremacy so complete that it borders on the surreal. The cost of achieving this dominance was substantial. The 8th Air Force alone lost over 4,700 heavy bombers during the war, roughly 40% of all B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds produced. Aircrew casualties exceeded 47,000, with over 26,000 killed in action. These losses were concentrated heavily in 1943 and early of 1944, before long-range fighter escorts and improved tactics reduced loss rates to sustainable levels. But the willingness to accept those casualties, combined with industrial capacity to replace losses, ultimately overwhelmed German defences through sheer numerical superiority. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 30,000 fighters and fighter pilots killed in action during the war in the West, the majority after mid-1943. German fighter pilot training programs collapsed under the weight of losses they couldn't replace. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft even when pilots and planes were available. Industrial production of fighters continued through early 1945, but the aircraft sat on airfields unused because there was no fuel to fly them, or no pilots trained to fly them, or both. The mathematical advantage that allowed the 8th Air Force to field 1,000 bombers in a single formation was matched by an equally devastating advantage in escort fighters, fuel supplies, replacement crews, and industrial production capacity. Germany could not match American output. Every loss was harder to replace. Every experienced pilot killed represented knowledge that couldn't be transferred to inadequately trained replacements. The experience of witnessing these massive formations had profound psychological effects on Germans beyond just the Luftwaffe pilots. Citizens in cities across Germany watched 1,000 bomber raids pass overhead. The formations so large that the sound of engines drowned out all other noise, the condensation trails of bombers and escorts crisscrossing the sky like a geometric pattern. They watched the flak batteries fire uselessly into formations too large to meaningfully damage. They saw bombs fall and felt the ground shake from explosions miles away, and they understood, even if their leaders refused to admit it, that the war was lost. You cannot defend against an enemy that can put 1,000 heavy bombers over your capital, and do it repeatedly, almost casually, with losses so low they're barely worth calculating. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, later wrote in his memoirs about the impact of the massive American raids on German morale. The psychological effect of the 1,000-bomber raids exceeded their physical destruction, he wrote. Workers in our factories would see these formations passing overhead and know that no German fighter force existed that could stop them. Our anti-aircraft guns fired constantly, but the formations were so large that shooting down 10 or 20 bombers meant nothing. There were hundreds more behind them. The sight was devastating to morale. People began to ask, if the Luftwaffe cannot stop the bombers, if our vaunted air defences are so easily overwhelmed, what else have we been told that isn't true? The massive raids undermined faith in the regime more effectively than any propaganda. The technical and organizational achievement represented by 1,000-bomber formations stands as one of the defining accomplishments of American air power in World War II. It required building an industrial base capable of producing heavy bombers at unprecedented rates. It required creating training infrastructure to produce tens of thousands of aircrew members. It required developing logistics systems to transport, supply, and maintain this force in England. It required tactical innovations in formation flying, defensive gunnery, and mission planning, and it required a level of organizational coordination that involved hundreds of thousands of personnel working toward a common objective. But perhaps more importantly, it required a fundamental understanding of modern warfare's industrial character. The American approach to strategic bombing was not about tactical elegance or operational brilliance, though both existed. It was about translating industrial capacity into military power through overwhelming force. Build more bombers than the enemy can shoot down, train more crews than the enemy can kill, produce more fighters than the enemy can match, sustain operations at a tempo the enemy cannot maintain. This approach works only when backed by genuine industrial superiority, but when it does work, it's decisive. The sight of 1,000 B-17 Flying Fortresses in formation was more than a tactical threat. It was a statement about national capacity, about what happens when industrial democracy fully mobilizes for war. Each bomber represented thousands of hours of labor in American factories. Each crew represented training infrastructure that spanned the country. Each mission represented fuel refined from American oil fields, ammunition produced in American arsenals, spare parts manufactured in American plants. The formations were flying manifestations of American industrial power, and they were unstoppable not because of superior technology or better training, though both helped, but because of sheer overwhelming numbers backed by productive capacity that Germany could not match. For the Luftwaffe pilots who watched these formations approach, who climbed into their fighters knowing the odds were mathematically impossible, who made attacking runs anyway because honor or duty or desperation demanded it, the experience was crushing. These were often skilled aviators, veterans of years of combat, holders of Knight's Crosses and oak leaves, men with dozens or hundreds of victories, and they were rendered irrelevant by numbers. Their skill didn't matter when outnumbered 5-1. Their experience didn't matter when their aircraft lacked fuel. Their courage, undeniable and often suicidal, didn't matter when the formations they attacked simply absorbed losses and continued to target. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, a Luftwaffe fighter ace with 176 confirmed victories, who survived the war and later became a founding member of the post-war German Air Force, provided perhaps the most clear-eyed assessment of what the massive American formations represented. In interviews decades later, he said, "We were fighting the wrong war by 1945. We were trying to be a tactical air force, focused on quality and individual skill, fighting an enemy that had become a strategic air force focused on quantity and industrial output. When you see 1,000 bombers in formation, you realize you're not fighting pilots anymore. You're fighting an industrial system, and you cannot shoot down an industrial system one bomber at a time." The Americans understood modern war better than we did. They understood that if you can build 1,000 bombers and train 1,000 crews and supply them indefinitely, you win. Simple as that. We were very good at what we did. They were better at what mattered. The final accounting is stark. From August 1942 through May 1945, the 8th Air Force flew over 350,000 bomber sorties, dropped more than 700,000 tons of bombs on European targets, and established air supremacy over the continent. The cost was heavy, nearly 48,000 casualties, but the alternative was allowing Nazi Germany to fight from behind intact industrial infrastructure and secure airspace. The decision to pursue strategic bombing, and to scale that campaign to 1,000 bomber formations, was instrumental in Allied victory. It forced Germany to divert massive resources to air defense. It destroyed industrial capacity that couldn't be replaced. It denied the Luftwaffe the fuel to operate, and it demonstrated to everyone watching, German civilians and soldiers alike, that the Reich was doomed. The men who flew in those formations, particularly the massive raids of late 1944 and 1945, understood what they were part of. They weren't just bombing targets, they were embodying industrial warfare's ultimate expression. Technical Sergeant Raymond Fredette, who flew the Berlin mission on February 3, 1945, survived the war and completed his tour. In a letter written to his family the day after that mission, preserved in his papers donated to the National World War II Museum, he describes what it felt like to be part of a 1,000-bomber formation. "We took off before dawn and assembled over England in the dark. When the sun came up and I could finally see the whole formation, it took my breath away. Bombers everywhere, as far as I could see in every direction. Above us, below us, to both sides, formations stacked on formations. The contrails alone created clouds, and I remember thinking, no one can stop this. This is what winning looks like. We flew to Berlin, dropped our bombs, and came home. And we'll do it again tomorrow if they tell us to. That's what the Germans can't match. Not our skill or our courage, they have that too. They can't match the fact that we can do this every day, that we can put 1,000 bombers over their capital on Tuesday and another 1,000 somewhere else on Wednesday, and keep doing it until the war ends. That's what breaks them. Not any single mission, but the knowledge that we can keep coming back, that there's always another 1,000 bombers, that we outnumber them so badly they cannot possibly win. The 1,000-bomber formations of 1945 represented the culmination of strategic bombing doctrine, organizational capability, and industrial capacity converging into a weapon system that proved decisive. They were the answer to the question that plagued the 8th Air Force in 1943. How do you conduct daylight strategic bombing over heavily defended targets at sustainable cost? The answer turned out to be, build enough bombers that losses become statistically irrelevant, concentrate them into formations so large that attacking them becomes futile, and escort them with fighters in numbers that establish complete air superiority. Execute this strategy consistently over months, accept the casualties it produces, and you achieve air dominance that makes enemy resistance impossible. For the Luftwaffe pilots who said, "We're finished," after counting 1,000 B-17 seconds in formation, they were recognizing a truth their leaders wouldn't admit. The war in the air was over, not because they lacked courage or skill or determination, but because they were fighting an enemy that had translated industrial superiority into aerial dominance through sheer, overwhelming numbers. And against numbers like that, individual heroism becomes tragic futility. The formations that filled the sky over Germany in the war's final months were monuments to industrial warfare's brutal calculus. Build more than the enemy can destroy, fight longer than the enemy can sustain, and victory follows inevitably. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.